Okay, welcome to the first video talking about trig. So again, you get to watch my hands do math. And after this, there'll be an assignment to do, and we'll go from there. Now, a lot of this stuff might be review, and that would be great. But just to start, I'll just pretend that we're starting from the beginning. Trigonometry is a math that has a lot of useful applications, and much of it came from the desire to be able to navigate your boat all over the world without seeing land. So the word trigonometry comes from, if you look at the word, the beginning is tri, which is short for triangle, and then metry at the end is metric, which is measure. So the word trigonometry loosely means triangle measure. Just like geometry, geo is earth measure. Isometry, iso, same measure. So trigonometry, the math of measuring triangles. Now, we're going to talk about sine, cosine, and tangent again, but historically, these words, sine, cosine, tangent, come from someplace. They just weren't made up. So here's my rough drawing of a sailing ship, and here's my sail. Right? Now, there's a right triangle. I'm going to call this angle, the measure of this angle down here, I'm going to use the variable theta. Theta is a Greek letter, right? So it's no different than x or y, it's just a different language. Right? Now, in any triangle, the angles add up to 180 degrees. So if you take away the right angle, that leaves 90 degrees left over. So these two angles are complementary. Complementary angles are called coangles. Right. So in ancient times, the leading edge of a sail was called the sine. So the sine ratio comes from using this side and the hypotenuse of a right triangle when you're dealing with this angle. Right? So as you know, sine is the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. The sine of an angle is a ratio, a fraction, made from doing the length of this side divided by the length of the hypotenuse. Right? These two angles are coangles. So if you go now and stand up here and look at this one, this is the side opposite the angle I'm working with. So this is called the cosine. It's the coangle sine. The coangle sine is called the cosine. So the cosine is this side over the hypotenuse. So if you go back and say, okay, coangles sine. Going to theta, you say the coangle's sine is this side over hypotenuse. So the cosine of an angle is the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. So these words cosine and sine come from these ancient words describing a sail. You don't have to remember that or anything, but that's just where it comes from. Now tangent, go back to what you know about geometry. The tangent line is the line that intersects the circle at one point and is perpendicular to the radius. So tangent, going back up here, uses that idea, and it's actually about slope. Slope is rise over run. So tangent is opposite over adjacent, rise over run. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so if you make definitions, here's your trig definitions, and I'll send you a table of this in your Google Classroom. But the sine of an angle, okay, is the ratio of the opposite side over the hypotenuse. Remember, the hypotenuse is always the side opposite the right angle. All right, so that's the hypotenuse. Stand on this angle. This is opposite. And the side that helps make the angle is called the adjacent side. Okay? So if you go down here and just use abbreviations, opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse. So now you come up with some definitions using those words that talk about a sail. The sine can be abbreviated SIN. The sine of any angle equals the fraction that's made from the length of the opposite over the length of the hypotenuse. Now this guy's a function. That's why it's in this course, because this is the story of functions. The angle is the input. This ratio is the output. The cosine of an angle is the length of the adjacent over the hypotenuse. Input the angle into the cosine function, out comes this ratio. Tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. Rise over run. Input the angle, out comes this fraction. Our calculator will give it to us as a decimal, but it's still a fraction. So a way to remember this, and talking to you guys yesterday on the phone, is the saying so, ka, toa. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. And tangent is opposite over adjacent. Just happens to work out in the English language that you can use this memory thing. Now, you can take these three fractions and flip them over. If you flip them over, you get the other three trig functions. They're called cosecant, secant, and cotangent. And they come from this picture too, but we don't really need to know where they came from. I don't really want to confuse the whole issue right now. So just remember that there's three more, and they come from these three fractions flipped over. So they're the reciprocal trig functions. Fractions flipped over are reciprocals. Take the sine function, flip it over. That's called the cosecant. So the cosecant of any angle is the hypotenuse over the opposite. The secant, abbreviated SEC, is the hypotenuse over the adjacent. It's the reciprocal of cosine. Cotangent COT of theta is the adjacent over the opposite. It's tangent reciprocal. Those are definitions. They're starting points. Okay, so here's a specific example. Here's the angle theta, and here is a right triangle. A 3, 4, 5 is the most common right triangle where all the sides are integers. 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 9 plus 16 is 25, square root 25, 5. In a right triangle, the Pythagorean theorem always works. In fact, it only works in a right triangle. All right, so if I want to find the 6 trig ratios, trig functions, really, okay, and you know the sides, you can use their definitions. sine opposite over hypotenuse. So with theta, 4 is the length of the opposite side. Cosine, adjacent over hypotenuse. Adjacent helps make the angle. It's one of the sides that makes the angle. Hypotenuse is always across from the right angle. That never changes. Tangent, opposite over adjacent. The tangent of the angle. Now take those three fractions and make their reciprocals. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. The one that starts with C matches with the one that starts with S. C, S. And that just happens to work in the English language. Okay, so the cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So cosecant is hypotenuse over opposite. Hypotenuse over opposite. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. Hypotenuse over adjacent. Hypotenuse over adjacent. Cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. So cotangent is adjacent over opposite. Adjacent over opposite. Okay, so now go and stand on the other angle and write its 6 trig ratios. I'm going to call this angle alpha. That's the Greek letter for alpha. Looks like a Jesus fish. Okay, so now I'm standing here, which changes the relationship of the sides. This is now the opposite side, and this is the adjacent side. It helps make the angle. Okay, so I'm going to find those 6. If you want to stop the video and just find them first, then you can check. Okay, so opposite over hypotenuse, adjacent over hypotenuse, opposite over adjacent. Cosecant starts with a C, so it's the reciprocal of the one that starts with an S. Sine is so, OH, so H over O, H over O, because we're dealing with this angle up here. Secant, reciprocal of cosine. Cotangent, reciprocal of tangent.